The gunfire did not stop. It echoed across the yard at Attica Correctional Facility again and again, loud and sharp, cutting through screams and smoke. Men ran with their hands in the air. Others fell to the ground. Blood spread across the prison yard as state troopers moved forward, firing into a place that only hours before had been filled with shouting voices asking to be heard. This was Attica, New York, USA, in September 1971. This was the deadliest prison riot in American history. By the time the noise finally stopped, dozens of people were dead, mostly inmates, many of them men from New York City. The prison was silent, broken, and forever changed. And even decades later, Attica would never escape what happened that day. Before the gunfire, before the blood, before Attica became a name spoken with fear and anger, it was just another prison in upstate New York. Attica Correctional Facility sat far from the busy streets of New York City. It was surrounded by fields, fences, and watchtowers. Many of the men locked inside came from the city, from Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. They were far from home. They were far from help. And they were angry. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Attica was overcrowded. The rules were strict. The conditions were harsh. Inmates complained about food, medical care, and punishment. Guards and inmates did not trust each other. Most of the inmates were black or Latino. Most of the guards were white and from nearby towns. That divide made everything worse. Men from New York City brought with them strong voices and strong opinions. They were used to being heard. Inside Attica, they felt ignored. Tension built slowly, day by day. Small fights broke out. Punishments became stricter. Complaints went nowhere. Then one morning, everything snapped. It started with a small fight between inmates and guards. Doors were opened. A group of inmates rushed forward. Guards were overwhelmed. Keys were taken. Inmates took control of parts of the prison. By the end of the first day, Attica was no longer under full control of the state. More than 1,000 inmates gathered in the yard. They shouted demands. They wanted better food, better medical care, fair treatment. They wanted change. Some guards were taken hostage. Outside the prison, leaders argued about what to do. Negotiators came in. Reporters listened. The whole country watched. Inside the yard, inmates from New York City became leaders. They spoke clearly. They organized. They tried to keep order among the men. For a brief moment, it felt like something might change. But fear was growing on both sides of the fence. Days passed. Talks broke down. And then the order was given. On the fourth day, state troopers stormed the prison. Tear gas filled the air. Gunfire followed. Chaos took over. When it was over, 43 people were dead. Attica would never be the same. Years later, new inmates still arrived at Attica from New York City. They heard the stories before they ever walked through the gate. They heard about the riot. They heard about the gunfire. They heard about the bodies in the yard. The past lived inside the walls. One of those inmates was Robert Jackson. Robert arrived at Attica decades after the riot, transferred from New York City. He was young, but he knew the history. Everyone did. On his first night, another inmate whispered to him through the bars. "This place remembers," the man said. Robert didn't understand at first. But he would. Attica still carried mistrust like a disease. Guards watched inmates closely. Inmates watched guards even closer. Any small problem felt big. Fights still happened. Lockdowns still came. And men from New York City were often seen as troublemakers, loud, proud, unwilling to stay silent. That made them targets. Robert tried to keep his head down. But the weight of Attica pressed on him every day. The old stories mixed with new anger. Older inmates talked about 1971 like it had happened yesterday. They never forgot, one man said. And they never forgave. Robert began to notice patterns. Certain areas felt more tense. Certain guards were harder. Certain inmates were watched more closely. The past shaped the present. One afternoon, a small argument in the yard turned into a fight. Guards rushed in fast this time. No chances were taken. The yard shut down. As inmates were forced back into their cells, Robert looked around and realized something chilling. Attica was still afraid of itself. The riot was over. But its legacy was alive. That night, Robert lay awake listening to distant doors slam and boots walk the tier. He thought about the men who had died in 1971. He thought about how many of them came from the same streets he did. New York City had sent them here. And Attica had never let them go. As the lights stayed on and the prison stayed quiet, one truth became clear. Attica's deadliest moment was not just history. It was a shadow. And that shadow was still shaping every inmate who walked through its gates. And what happened next would prove that the past at Attica was never truly buried. The lockdown after the memory of 1971 was not written on paper, but it was felt everywhere. At Attica Correctional Facility, the past did not stay in the past. It lived in the walls. It lived in the rules. It lived in the way guards stood, the way inmates spoke, and the way silence could suddenly turn dangerous. Robert Jackson began to understand that during his first real weeks inside Attica, the prison ran on routine. Count in the morning. Breakfast trays slid through slots. Work details called out. Yard time announced. On the surface, it looked orderly. Underneath, it was tense. Robert came from New York City, Brooklyn. He had grown up around noise, arguments, and crowds. But Attica felt different. The quiet here was heavier. Every sound mattered more. Older inmates told stories in low voices. Not loud stories. Careful ones. They talked about September 1971 like it was a scar that never healed. They talked about how guards never fully trusted inmates again. They talked about how inmates never believed guards would protect them. They say it's history, one man told Robert. But history runs this place. Robert started to notice how inmates from New York City were watched differently. Guards looked at them longer. Questioned them more. Broke up their groups faster. City inmates were seen as leaders. Or trouble. Sometimes both. During yard time, Robert stayed near the fence, watching how men moved. Groups formed naturally. Men from New York City stuck together. Men from upstate areas stayed close to each other. The lines were not written anywhere, but everyone knew them. A simple look could mean something. A step too close could start a fight. Guards watched from towers and along the yard. Their hands rested near radios. Their eyes scanned constantly. They did not want another 1971. But fear made people react too fast. Or too hard. One afternoon, a small argument broke out over a basketball game. It started with words. Then a shove. Nothing serious. Guards rushed in immediately. Too many guards. Too much force. The yard was shut down. Inmates were forced back inside, angry and confused. The punishment felt bigger than the problem. That was Attica's legacy. Small sparks were treated like fires. And fires still happened anyway. Inside the housing unit, Robert's cell neighbor was an older man named James Turner. James had been at Attica for many years. He had arrived not long after the riot. I saw the changes, James said one night. Before and after. Robert listened. Before, there was anger, James said. After, there was fear. Fear sticks longer. Robert asked him if things ever got better. James shook his head slowly. They just get quieter. Quiet doesn't mean safe. The psychological pressure of Attica was worse than the physical danger. Death was part of the prison story, even if executions did not happen there like they once did. Men knew others had died in the yard. They knew the state had lost control once. That knowledge sat in every cell. Robert began to feel it during sleep. He woke up suddenly at night, heart racing, unsure why. The prison never fully rested. Doors slammed. Radios crackled. Someone always shouted somewhere. New inmates arrived from New York City every month. Some were young and loud. Others were quiet but angry. They came in already knowing Attica's name. That reputation shaped how they acted. Some tried to prove themselves. Others tried to disappear. Both choices were dangerous. One morning, during work detail, Robert noticed guards arguing among themselves. Their voices were sharp. Something was wrong. Later that day, the yard opened late. That was never a good sign. When inmates stepped outside, the air felt wrong. Not quiet. Tight. Robert saw groups forming faster than usual. Men whispered. Heads turned. Everyone was watching everyone else. James leaned close to Robert. Something's coming, he said. Robert believed him. The tension came from a transfer. Several inmates from New York City had arrived the night before. They had old ties. Old problems. Word traveled fast. Attica did not give people time to cool off. During yard time, an argument broke out near the benches. Guards moved in quickly, but this time inmates did not back away. More men stepped forward. Voices rose. Someone threw a punch. The fight lasted less than a minute before guards rushed in with force. Batons were raised. Orders were shouted. Men dropped to the ground. The fight was over. But the damage was done. 2 inmates were injured. One was taken away bleeding. The prison locked down again. In his cell, Robert felt the anger rise in him. Not just fear. Anger. Why did it always feel like punishment came first and understanding never came at all? That question had been asked in 1971. And it was still unanswered. Days passed under lockdown. Food came cold. Showers were limited. Phones were shut off. Visits were cancelled. Pressure built. Inmates blamed guards. Guards blamed inmates. No one trusted anyone. James spoke less. He stayed on his bunk, eyes closed, like he was remembering something he didn't want to see again. Robert tried to write letters home but tore them up. He didn't know how to explain Attica. Words felt too small. When the lockdown lifted, the prison felt different again. Harder. Guards were stricter. Inmates were quieter. The balance was shifting. Robert noticed more searches. Cells torn apart. Mattresses cut open. Personal items scattered. Weapons were found. That scared everyone. Because weapons meant planning. And planning meant violence might not be far behind. One evening, during dinner movement, the lights flickered. Just once. The hallway went silent. Every inmate froze. Then the lights came back on. Nothing happened. But everyone felt it. That flicker reminded people how fast control could slip. James looked at Robert and whispered, "That's how it starts." The next day, the yard opened under heavy watch. More guards. Fewer inmates allowed out at once. Robert stepped onto the concrete slowly. He scanned the yard. Across the space, he saw familiar faces from New York City. Men he didn't trust. Men who didn't trust him. The silence was thick. Then someone shouted from across the yard. Not a threat. A name. A name from 1971. That was all it took. The yard erupted. This time it wasn't just fists. Men rushed each other in waves. Guards shouted orders that were swallowed by noise. Robert tried to back away but was pushed forward by the crowd. He stumbled. Someone grabbed his shirt. Another inmate slammed into him. The riot was smaller than 1971. But it felt just as real. Guards responded fast. Tear gas filled the air. Sirens screamed. Inmates dropped to the ground coughing, choking, afraid. The yard was retaken. But when the smoke cleared, the fear stayed. Robert lay on the ground, face pressed to concrete, breathing hard. His eyes burned. His chest hurt. As he was cuffed and pulled to his feet, he looked around and saw something that made his stomach turn. Blood. Not a lot. But enough. Someone had been hurt badly. The prison went into full lockdown again. Later, inside his cell, Robert sat shaking. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. James spoke softly from the next bunk. "They say Attica learned its lesson," James said. "But fear isn't a lesson. It's a cycle." Robert finally understood. Attica wasn't just a prison shaped by a riot. It was a prison trapped inside it. The deadliest riot in U.S. history had ended decades ago, but its legacy still decided how people lived, moved, and fought inside these walls. And as the night deepened and guards walked the tiers with tense faces, Robert knew something worse might still be ahead. Because the past at Attica did not stay buried. It waited. And it was waiting again. The silence after the last lockdown was heavier than anything Robert Jackson had felt before. At Attica Correctional Facility, silence was never peaceful. It was a warning. It meant everyone was watching, waiting, remembering. The riot that had just ended was smaller than the one in 1971, but the fear it brought felt just as deep. Robert sat on his bunk, his hands resting on his knees, trying to slow his breathing. His eyes burned from the tear gas. His throat felt dry. Around him, the prison hummed with low sounds, boots on concrete, radios crackling, doors clanking shut and opening again. Attica was awake. The lockdown stretched into days, then weeks. Time inside the cell felt thick and slow. Meals came through the slot. Showers were rare. Phones stayed silent. Visits were cancelled again. For many inmates, the worst part was not the punishment. It was the waiting. Robert spent hours staring at the wall, thinking about the men who had stood in that same prison yard in 1971. Men who had shouted for food, for care, for respect. Men who had believed someone might listen. They were met with gunfire. That knowledge pressed on him every moment. James Turner, the older inmate, spoke less now. When he did, his voice was quiet and tired. "They never healed this place," James said one night. "They just sealed it." Robert understood what he meant. Attica was built to hold bodies, not pain. And the pain had nowhere to go. Guards were tense too. Officer faces looked harder. Their movements were sharp. Everyone was afraid of losing control again. And fear made people act fast. Sometimes too fast. During one late-night count, a guard stopped at Robert's cell longer than usual. He looked inside, eyes scanning, then moved on without a word. That silence felt like a threat. The days dragged on. Then one morning, the loudspeaker crackled to life. The lockdown would be eased. Carefully. Slowly. When Robert stepped out of his cell for the first time in weeks, the hallway felt strange. Like it didn't belong to him anymore. Inmates walked quietly, heads down, shoulders tight. No one joked. No one laughed. Attica had become a place where even sound felt dangerous. The yard reopened under strict limits. Fewer inmates. More guards. Towers fully staffed. Robert stood near the fence again, his old safe spot. He could see the scars on the concrete where past violence had spilled. Some stains never came out. Around him, men from New York City gathered close. Men from Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx. They spoke quietly, but their eyes moved constantly. Across the yard, inmates from other parts of the state watched them carefully. The divide was still there. It always was. James stood beside Robert, leaning slightly on the fence. "You see it?" James asked. Robert nodded. "They're scared." James shook his head. "No. They're ready." That scared Robert more. The psychological pressure of Attica came from never knowing when things would explode again. One wrong look. One wrong word. One mistake by a guard or an inmate. Everyone carried the weight of history. Robert thought about how many inmates from New York City had passed through Attica over the years. Thousands. Many came in already angry at the system. Others became angry inside. The prison didn't soften people. It sharpened them. Later that week, a rumor spread through the units. An official investigation was coming. State officials. Lawyers. Outside eyes. Some inmates felt hope. Others felt danger. Investigations meant questions. Questions meant talking. Talking inside prison could get you hurt. James warned Robert to stay quiet. "Truth is dangerous in here," James said. "Always has been." Robert believed him. The investigators arrived quietly. No cameras. No speeches. Just clipboards and serious faces. They spoke with staff. They spoke with a few inmates. Most inmates were not called. That alone said a lot. The investigation changed little at first. Guards stayed strict. Lockdowns continued to come and go. Yard time was still limited. Searches were constant. Weapons were found again. That news spread fear through the prison faster than anything else. Weapons meant planning. Planning meant someone believed violence was the answer. Robert noticed something else too. The newer inmates, especially those from New York City, were different. They knew Attica's history. They talked about it openly. Some spoke with pride. Others with anger. 1971 had become a symbol. For some, it meant resistance. For others, it meant death. One night, Robert heard shouting from another unit. Then alarms. Then silence. By morning, word spread. An inmate had been badly injured in a fight. Not a riot. Not yet. But close enough. The prison locked down again. Robert sat on his bunk, staring at the floor. He felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. Attica drained people slowly. Day by day. James coughed softly from his bunk. "They say Attica changed America," James said. "Maybe it did. But it never changed itself." Robert asked him why he stayed here so long. James smiled sadly. "Some places don't let go of you." When the lockdown lifted again, something felt different. Calmer. Not safe. But calmer. The yard opened. Inmates moved cautiously. Guards kept their distance but stayed alert. Robert noticed fewer groups forming. More space between people. Fear was doing what rules could not. Keeping people apart. For a short time, Attica felt almost quiet. This was the low point after the storm. Robert allowed himself to hope, just a little, that things might finally slow down. That hope didn't last. One afternoon, during work detail, a guard slipped on a wet floor. It was nothing serious. He stood up quickly. But an inmate laughed. That laugh cut through the room. Guards rushed in. Voices rose. The inmate was pulled away roughly. Word spread fast. That night, tension returned. Inmates whispered that the punishment was too harsh. Guards whispered that inmates were pushing limits again. The line was thinning. The next day, The yard opened under grey skies. The air felt heavy, like rain was coming. Robert stood near James, scanning the yard. Then he heard it. A chant. Low at first. Then louder. Not angry words. Names. Names of men who had died in 1971. The chant spread across the yard. Guards shouted for silence. The chant grew louder. Robert's heart raced. He had heard stories of this before. Older inmates had warned him. When names are spoken, the past is awake. Guards rushed in. Orders were shouted. Sirens began to wail. Someone threw something. No one knew who. The yard exploded again. Not as wide as before. Not as fast. But just as dangerous. Robert ran toward the fence, heart pounding. James stumbled beside him. Tear gas canisters landed nearby. Smoke filled the air. Men dropped to the ground coughing. Guards moved in quickly, determined not to lose control. The riot was crushed within minutes. But the message was clear. Attica was still restless. Still angry. Still scarred. That night, Robert lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. His body ached. His mind wouldn't stop racing. He thought about the men in 1971 who believed Attica could change. He thought about the men today who didn't believe in change at all. And he thought about himself. How long before Attica changed him too? Days later, news came quietly through the unit. The investigation was ending. Reports would be written. Recommendations would be made. Life would go on. Inside Attica, inmates reacted with tired shrugs. They had seen this before. Outside attention faded. Inside tension remained. Robert realized then that Attica's true legacy was not just the riot. It was what came after. Decades of mistrust. Decades of fear. Decades of men from New York City sent far from home into a prison that never forgot its bloodiest day. The deadliest prison riot in U.S. history was over in 1971. But its shadow still ruled Attica. And as Robert lay awake listening to the prison breathe around him, he understood something deeply and painfully clear. Attica was not haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by memory. And memory, inside these walls, was the most dangerous thing of all.